Imagine being told you have one chance, one single opportunity to prove your innocence. And if you fail, you're done. Forever. No appeals. No second thoughts. No mercy. That's not some dystopian nightmare. That was actually real. And it was terrifying. You're probably thinking, wait, what? That can't be real. But trust me, it was. And here's the kicker. This punishment was considered perfectly reasonable for hundreds of years. Welcome to the world of medieval justice, where the one-time sentence ruled supreme. A punishment so extreme, so final, that it makes modern legal systems look like a walk in the park. And today we're diving deep into why this rare judicial penalty existed, how it worked, and most importantly, why every civilization that used it eventually abandoned it. Because here's the thing, there's a reason you've never heard of this punishment. And that reason is way more fascinating than you'd think. But before we get there, we need to understand what we're actually talking about. Because the one-time sentence wasn't just one thing. It was a whole system of legal logic that shaped how justice worked for centuries. Let's set the scene. It's the 12th century. You're living in medieval Europe, and honestly, life is rough. Like really rough. There's no CSI. No forensic evidence. No DNA testing. Heck, most people can't even read or write. So when someone commits a crime, how do you prove they did it? How do you determine guilt or innocence when you don't have any of the tools we take for granted today? This is where medieval legal logic comes in. And fair warning, it's going to sound absolutely wild to modern ears. Medieval justice was built on a completely different foundation than what we have today. See, back then, people believed that God was actively involved in the justice system. Yeah, you heard that right. They thought divine intervention would reveal the truth. This led to some pretty creative and, let's be honest, terrifying methods of determining guilt. Trial by combat. Trial by ordeal. Trial by fire. These weren't just dramatic flourishes. These were legitimate legal procedures that courts actually used. But the one-time sentence? That was different. That was special. The one-time sentence was based on a simple but brutal premise. You get one shot to prove yourself. One opportunity. One chance. And whatever happens during that chance determines your fate for eternity. Now, here's where it gets interesting. The one-time sentence wasn't uniform across all of medieval Europe. Different regions had different interpretations. Some places used it for specific crimes. Others used it as a last resort when other punishments failed. But they all shared one common thread, the absolute, unshakable finality of it. Think about that for a second. In our modern legal system, you've got appeals. You've got retrials. You've got plea bargains and reduced sentences and parole hearings. There are a million ways to revisit a verdict, to reconsider the evidence, to give someone a second chance. The one-time sentence had none of that. Zero. Zip. Nada. Once the sentence was carried out, that was it. The book was closed. The chapter was finished. Your fate was sealed. And here's the twist that's going to blow your mind. Sometimes, the sentence wasn't even a traditional punishment. Sometimes it was a test, a challenge, an ordeal that you had to survive. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's rewind a bit and look at where this whole thing actually came from. The roots of the one-time sentence go back further than you might think. Way back to ancient legal traditions that predated medieval Europe by centuries. See, the concept of trial by ordeal, which is closely related to the one-time sentence, shows up in ancient Mesopotamian law. The Code of Hammurabi, dating back to 1750 BCE, included provisions for river ordeals. If someone was accused of sorcery, they'd be thrown into the river. If they survived, they were innocent. If they drowned, well, they were guilty. Problem solved, right? Yeah, no, that's horrifying. But it shows you how old this concept really is. Fast forward to medieval Europe, and these ancient ideas got mixed together with Christian theology and feudal power structures. The result? A legal system that modern people would find absolutely bizarre. The one-time sentence really started taking shape around the 11th and 12th centuries. This was a time of massive social change. The feudal system was solidifying. The Catholic Church was consolidating power. Kings were trying to establish centralized authority. And all of these power players needed a way to maintain control. Enter the one-time sentence. It was the perfect tool for a society that valued order above everything else. Think about it. If you know that one mistake, one failed test, one moment of bad luck could end your life or destroy your reputation forever, you're going to be pretty careful about stepping out of line. It was social control masquerading as justice. But here's what makes it really interesting. Different regions developed wildly different versions of this punishment. Let me break down a few examples because this is where things get really wild. In England, the one-time sentence often took the form of trial by combat for serious crimes like treason or murder. Two people would fight, and whoever won was declared right in the eyes of God. The loser? Well, if they survived the fight, they'd face execution anyway. One chance, one battle, one outcome. In France, particularly during the reign of Louis IX, the guy they literally made a saint, the one-time sentence was often tied to trials by hot iron. The accused would have to carry a red-hot piece of iron for a certain distance. Then their hands would be bandaged. 3 days later, the bandages would be removed. If the wounds were healing cleanly, you were innocent. If they were infected, guilty. And the punishment would be carried out immediately, with no possibility of appeal. One test, one examination, one verdict, forever. In the Germanic regions, they had something called trial by cold water. The accused would be bound and thrown into a body of water that had been blessed by a priest. If you floated, you were guilty because the pure water rejected you. If you sank, you were innocent. Of course, if you sank, you might also drown, but hey, at least you died with your reputation intact, right? I know what you're thinking. This is insane. How did anyone think this was a good idea? But here's the thing, from their perspective, it made perfect sense. They genuinely believed that God wouldn't let an innocent person be condemned. They thought divine intervention would ensure justice prevailed. The one-time sentence wasn't seen as cruel or arbitrary. It was seen as the ultimate form of fairness, letting God himself decide guilt or innocence. Wild, right? But wait, because it gets even more complicated. The one-time sentence wasn't always about physical ordeals. Sometimes it was purely legal. In some jurisdictions, certain crimes carried mandatory, irreversible sentences that had no possibility of reduction or appeal. First-time offenders for specific crimes would receive a punishment that couldn't be changed, modified, or reconsidered under any circumstances. This is where the one-time part really comes into play. You were sentenced once, and that was it. The sentence was carried out, and there was no going back. No king could pardon you. No court could reconsider. No new evidence could save you. The finality was the point. And this leads us to a question that's probably been nagging at you. How exactly did this work in practice? What did it actually look like when someone faced the one-time sentence? Well, buckle up, because the reality is somehow even stranger than you'd imagine. Let's walk through what would actually happen if you were accused of a serious crime in, say, 13th century England, and you ended up facing a one-time sentence. First, you'd be arrested. Pretty standard so far, right? But here's where things start to diverge from modern legal procedure. There was no innocent until proven guilty. That concept, that's a relatively modern invention. Instead, if you were accused of a serious crime by someone of good standing in the community, you were already pretty much cooked. Your accuser would present their case to a local lord or church official. Notice I said present their case, not provide evidence, because evidence in the way we think of it, that wasn't really a thing. Someone might testify that they saw you commit the crime, or they might just say they heard you did it, or maybe you had a reputation for being troublesome, and that was evidence enough. If the accusation was serious enough, you'd be given a choice, and this is where the one-time sentence comes in. You could either confess and face a predetermined punishment, or you could prove your innocence through trial by ordeal. And here's the kicker. Refusing both options was itself an admission of guilt. Let's say you chose trial by ordeal. There were several types, and which one you got often depended on your social status, the nature of the crime, and local customs. Trial by hot iron was a common one. You'd be required to carry a red-hot iron bar, usually about 1 to 3 pounds, for 9 paces. 9 specific paces. Not 8, not 10, 9. After completing this walk, your hand would be bandaged and sealed with the judge's seal to prevent tampering. Then you'd wait 3 days. 3 agonizing days of knowing that your fate was literally festering under those bandages. On the 3rd day, the bandages would be removed in front of witnesses. If the burn was healing cleanly, you were declared innocent. If there was infection, pus, or what they called unclean healing, you were guilty. And here's the truly brutal part. The punishment for guilt would be carried out immediately. That same day. No waiting. No appeals process. No clemency hearings. 1 test. 1 examination. 1 verdict. 1 punishment. Forever. Trial by water worked differently but followed the same one-time logic. You'd be bound, hands to feet, curled up, and lowered into blessed water. The water was usually a local river or a large barrel specifically maintained for this purpose. If you floated, the pure water was rejecting you, which meant you were guilty. If you sank, you were innocent. The rope you were attached to would, hopefully, be used to pull you back up before you drowned. But here's the thing that's going to make your blood run cold. There are documented cases where people were pulled up too late. They were declared innocent, but they were also dead. Congratulations, your reputation is intact. Also, you're deceased. Enjoy your posthumous vindication. Trial by combat was reserved for the upper classes and for particularly serious crimes. 2 parties would fight, often to the death, and whoever won was declared to be in the right. But here's what's fascinating. You could hire a champion to fight for you. Yes, seriously. Medieval legal proxies were a thing. If you were rich enough, you could pay a professional fighter to battle on your behalf. But, and this is important, even if your champion won, the result was still final. One fight, one outcome, one resolution, no rematches, no best 2 out of 3. The one-time sentence wasn't just about the punishment. It was about the absolute finality of the verdict. Once the ordeal was complete, once the trial was finished, once the judgment was rendered, that was it. The case was closed forever. Now, you might be wondering, did people try to game the system? Did they try to cheat these ordeals? Oh, absolutely. And the authorities knew it. There are historical records of people treating their hands with protective herbs before trial by hot iron. There are accounts of people taking deep breaths and holding air in their lungs to help them float during trial by water. There are stories of fixed fights in trial by combat. But if you were caught trying to cheat, that was itself proof of guilt. And the punishment would be even more severe. The system was designed to be inescapable. It was meant to inspire such fear, such absolute terror, that people wouldn't dare commit crimes in the first place. Which brings us to a crucial question. Did it actually work? Did the one-time sentence actually reduce crime and maintain social order? Well, that's where things get really interesting, because the answer is complicated. Let me tell you about a case that happened in 1215. Yeah, that's a specific year, and there's a reason I'm being precise here. Because what happened in 1215 changed everything. There was a woman named Gunnald in England. She was accused of murdering her husband. The evidence? Her neighbor said she'd heard arguing the night he died. That was it. That was the entire case. Gunnald maintained her innocence. She had no choice but to undergo trial by ordeal, specifically trial by hot iron. The ordeal was carried out according to procedure. She carried the iron. Her hands were bandaged. 3 days later, the bandages were removed. The wounds were festering. By the legal standards of the time, this meant she was guilty. She was hanged the next day. But here's where it gets dark. 2 weeks later, Gunnald's husband's actual killer confessed on his deathbed. A completely different person. Someone who had a grudge against the husband and had poisoned him. Gunnald was innocent, and she was dead. Now, in a modern legal system, this would be called a miscarriage of justice. There would be investigations, policy changes, compensation for the family. But under the one-time sentence, there was nothing to be done. The case was closed. The sentence had been carried out. Justice, as they understood it, had been served. Except it hadn't. And people knew it. This case and others like it started to create doubt. Not everywhere, not all at once, but slowly cracks began forming in the system. But before we get to how it all fell apart, let me tell you about another case. This one's even more wild. In 1231, there was a nobleman in France, we'll call him Robert because his full name is a mouthful. Robert was accused of treason against the crown. Serious stuff. The kind of crime that carried a death sentence. Robert demanded trial by combat, as was his right as a nobleman. The king appointed a champion to fight on behalf of the crown. Robert, confident in his fighting skills, chose to represent himself. The combat took place in front of hundreds of witnesses. It was a spectacle, a show. Entertainment and justice all rolled into one. Robert won. He actually won. He defeated the king's champion in single combat. According to the law, this meant he was innocent. God had shown favor to him. The case should have been closed. But here's the twist. The king didn't like that outcome, so he declared that Robert must have cheated somehow. Without any evidence, without any proof, the king simply stated that divine judgment had been corrupted. Robert was executed anyway. Wait, what? How does that work with the whole one-time sentence thing? Isn't the point that the verdict is final and can't be changed? You'd think so. But here's what this case reveals. The one-time sentence only worked when the powerful people wanted it to work. When the outcome was inconvenient, rules could be bent or broken entirely. This case caused massive controversy. Nobles across France were outraged. If trial by combat could be overruled by royal decree, then what was the point? The entire system was based on the idea that God determined the outcome. If kings could override God's judgment, then the whole thing was a sham. This is important because it shows us something crucial. The one-time sentence wasn't really about divine justice at all. It was about power and control. Let me give you one more case. This one's from Germany in the late 13th century. A man named Heinrich was accused of theft. Not murder, not treason, theft. He supposedly stole a loaf of bread and some cloth from a merchant. For this crime, he was subjected to trial by water. He floated. He was declared guilty. The punishment for theft? Having his hand cut off. One ordeal. One verdict. One brutal, permanent punishment. Heinrich survived the amputation, but his life was essentially over. He couldn't work. He couldn't support his family. He became a beggar. Years later, we're talking like 15 years later, the actual thief was caught committing a similar crime and confessed to the earlier theft that Heinrich had been punished for. Heinrich was innocent. He'd lost his hand for a crime he didn't commit. And there was no recourse, no compensation, no justice. He died in poverty, still bearing the physical scar of a punishment he should never have received. These cases and countless others like them started to pile up, and people began to notice a pattern. The one-time sentence was producing results that even medieval society found troubling. But here's what's really fascinating. It wasn't the cruelty that bothered people. Medieval society was brutal. Public executions were entertainment. Torture was standard legal procedure. What bothered people was the irreversibility combined with the obvious fallibility. They could accept harsh punishments. They could accept violent justice. What they struggled with was permanent consequences for potentially wrong verdicts. And that tension between finality and fallibility is what eventually brought the whole system crashing down. But before it fell, the one-time sentence had a profound impact on the people who lived under it. And that impact, it shaped medieval society in ways that still echo today. Let's talk about what it was actually like to live in a society where the one-time sentence was a real threat hanging over everyone's head. Imagine waking up every day knowing that a single accusation could end your life. Not a fair trial with evidence and witnesses and legal representation. Just an accusation from the right person, followed by an ordeal you might not survive even if you're innocent. That does something to people. It changes how you act, how you think, how you interact with your community. First off, it created a culture of extreme conformity. If you stood out in any way, if you were different, if you made enemies, you were vulnerable. So people tried desperately to fit in, to stay in everyone's good graces, to never rock the boat. This wasn't just about following laws. This was about social survival. There are records of people giving excessive gifts to neighbors they'd argued with. Why? Because that neighbor could accuse them of a crime, and the accusation alone could be enough to trigger a one-time sentence. Think about how that warps social relationships. Every interaction becomes transactional. Every disagreement is a potential threat. Trust becomes impossible because anyone could potentially destroy you with a single accusation. It also created intense religious fervor. Remember, people believed that God determined the outcome of these ordeals. So if you survived trial by hot iron, it wasn't luck. It was divine intervention. This meant that people who survived ordeals were often seen as specially blessed by God. They'd gain social status, respect, even a kind of celebrity. There are documented cases of people who survived ordeals becoming local heroes. Their survival was proof of God's favor, which meant they must be especially righteous. On the flip side, people who were declared guilty through ordeal weren't just criminals. They were sinners rejected by God Himself. The social stigma was immense. But here's where it gets really psychologically twisted. Even if you were innocent and you knew you were innocent, undergoing an ordeal was terrifying, because you couldn't be sure that God would save you. What if you'd committed some other sin? What if God decided to punish you for something else? What if divine judgment wasn't about this specific crime but about your overall worthiness? This created profound anxiety and spiritual crisis. People would spend days before an ordeal in prayer, fasting, giving to the poor, trying to make themselves worthy of divine protection. The psychological torture of the waiting period between the accusation and the ordeal was often worse than the physical ordeal itself. There are records of people confessing to crimes they didn't commit just to avoid the ordeal. They'd rather face a known punishment than risk the unknown outcome of divine judgment. Think about that. People were so terrified of the one-time sentence that they'd rather be punished for crimes they didn't commit than take the chance that God might find them unworthy. The social impact was equally profound. The one-time sentence reinforced existing power structures in really insidious ways. See, the wealthy and the powerful could often avoid ordeals entirely. They had connections, influence, the ability to pay fines or provide guarantees. The one-time sentence was disproportionately applied to the poor and the powerless. This created a two-tier justice system. If you were rich, you could negotiate, bargain, find alternatives. If you were poor, you faced the ordeal. And because ordeals were public spectacles, they served as brutal reminders of who had power and who didn't. When a peasant was forced to carry hot iron while the nobility watched from comfortable seats, the social hierarchy was literally on display. It also created opportunities for abuse that are genuinely horrifying. Local officials could essentially target anyone they wanted by encouraging accusations. Don't like someone? Accuse them of a crime and watch them face an ordeal they might not survive. There are records suggesting that the one-time sentence was sometimes used to eliminate political rivals, silence critics, or even acquire property. If someone owned land you wanted, accuse them of a crime, watch them fail the ordeal, and then claim their property after their execution. It was legal murder dressed up as divine justice. But here's what's fascinating from a historical perspective. Despite all of this, despite the obvious problems and the clear potential for abuse, the system persisted for centuries. Why? Because it served the needs of the people in power. It maintained social order, kept people afraid and compliant, It reinforced the authority of both the state and the church. The one-time sentence wasn't a bug in the medieval justice system. It was a feature. And it might have continued indefinitely if not for a series of changes that began in the early 13th century. Changes that would eventually bring the whole system crashing down. But before we get to that, I want you to sit with this for a moment. The one-time sentence wasn't some distant historical curiosity. It was a system that real people lived under, suffered through, and died because of. Every case I've mentioned, every example I've given, those were real human beings with real lives, real families, real hopes and fears. And the system destroyed them, often for crimes they didn't commit. Which brings us to the question that medieval people themselves eventually started asking. Can a justice system based on irreversible verdicts and divine ordeals actually be called justice at all? The answer to that question would change the course of legal history. And it all started with a church council in 1215. Yeah, the same year as that case I mentioned earlier with Gunnald. That's not a coincidence. 1215. The Fourth Lateran Council. This is where it all came crashing down. Pope Innocent III. And yes, that's actually his name, you can't make this stuff up. Gathered church officials from across Europe for one of the most important councils in church history. They discussed a lot of things. Transubstantiation, confession, clerical conduct. But buried in the midst of all these theological debates was a decision that would fundamentally change how justice worked in medieval Europe. The church officially withdrew support for trial by ordeal. Just like that, after centuries of being the backbone of the legal system, the church said, "Nope, we're done with this." But why? What changed? Here's the thing. The church had been getting uncomfortable with trial by ordeal for a while. All those cases like Gunnald's, where innocent people were clearly being punished. Those were creating a theological problem. If God was determining the outcome of these ordeals, then God was sometimes declaring innocent people guilty, which either meant God was wrong, or the ordeals weren't actually revealing divine judgment. The first option was heresy. The second option meant the entire system was a sham. So the church found itself in an impossible position. They couldn't admit that trial by ordeal was flawed without admitting that they'd been endorsing a corrupt system for centuries. But they couldn't keep supporting it when the problems were becoming more and more obvious. The Fourth Lateran Council was their way out. They declared that trial by ordeal was a misuse of sacred rites. That forcing God to perform miracles on demand was actually blasphemous. That human beings shouldn't presume to know God's will through such crude methods. It was a complete theological reversal. And it pulled the rug out from under the entire one-time sentence system. Because here's the thing. Without church participation, trial by ordeal couldn't function. The water had to be blessed. The priests had to oversee the proceedings. The religious authority had to validate the results. When the church withdrew, the whole mechanism broke down. But this created a massive problem. If you couldn't use trial by ordeal anymore, how were you supposed to determine guilt or innocence? Remember, they still didn't have forensic evidence. They still didn't have modern investigative techniques. They still relied on methods that seem completely inadequate to us today. The solution? They started developing alternatives. And this is where legal history gets really interesting. In England, they began expanding the jury system. Instead of divine judgment, you'd have a group of your peers examine the evidence and render a verdict. Revolutionary, right? Except early juries were kind of a mess. Jurors were often people who already knew about the case. In fact, they were sometimes chosen specifically because they had knowledge of the crime. The idea was that they'd bring their own information to the deliberation. It was far from perfect, but it was better than trial by ordeal because verdicts could be questioned, appealed, or reconsidered if new evidence emerged. The irreversibility of the one-time sentence was starting to crack. In France, they developed a system called inquisitorial procedure, where trained judges would investigate cases, gather evidence, and render verdicts based on legal reasoning rather than divine judgment. Again, not perfect. There was still torture involved in getting confessions. There was still bias and corruption. But the principle was different. Human reason, not divine intervention, determined guilt. In the Germanic regions, they started requiring more substantial evidence for convictions. Multiple witnesses, consistent testimony, physical proof when possible. The standard of proof was rising. The bar for conviction was getting higher. The ability to reconsider verdicts was becoming more accepted. All of this happened remarkably quickly. Within a generation or two of the Fourth Lateran Council, trial by ordeal had mostly disappeared from Western Europe. But the one-time sentence didn't die immediately. Because remember, the one-time sentence wasn't just about ordeals. It was also about the finality of sentencing. That part took longer to change. In some jurisdictions, well into the 14th and even 15th centuries, certain sentences still carried that irreversible character. Once pronounced, they couldn't be appealed or modified. But gradually, even that began to erode. Systems of appeal emerged. Kings began exercising more frequent pardons and commutations. The idea that a verdict could be reconsidered, that new evidence could matter, that mercy could be granted, all of that started to take root. By the 16th century, the one-time sentence as a legal concept had essentially disappeared from European law. But here's what's fascinating. It didn't disappear because people suddenly became more humane or compassionate. Medieval Europe was still brutal. They still had public executions. They still used torture. They still had harsh, violent punishments. What changed wasn't the cruelty. What changed was the epistemology, the way people thought about how we know things. The one-time sentence was based on the idea that truth could be revealed through divine intervention. When that idea lost credibility, the entire system collapsed. The shift from divine judgment to human reason as the basis for legal verdicts was one of the most profound transformations in Western legal history. And it started because of all those cases like Gunnels. All those obviously innocent people who died because of a system that couldn't admit it was wrong. The one-time sentence died not because people became better, but because the system's failures became too obvious to ignore. So what does all of this mean for us today? Why should we care about a punishment system that disappeared centuries ago? Well, here's the thing. The one-time sentence is gone, but the questions it raised are still with us. Think about it. We still struggle with the tension between finality and fallibility. Every time there's a debate about the death penalty, that tension is right there. How can we have a punishment that's irreversible when we know our justice system isn't perfect? The Innocence Project has exonerated hundreds of people using DNA evidence. People who were convicted, sentenced, and in some cases executed for crimes they didn't commit. Sound familiar? It's the same problem medieval society faced with trial by ordeal. Different methods, same fundamental issue. Our systems for determining guilt aren't infallible. The one-time sentence failed because medieval people eventually realized you can't have absolute finality when you don't have absolute certainty. We're still learning that lesson. But there's another legacy of the one-time sentence that's even more relevant: the way it was used for social control. Remember how I mentioned that the one-time sentence was disproportionately applied to the poor and powerless? How it reinforced existing hierarchies? How it could be weaponized against political enemies or social outsiders? Yeah, we still see echoes of that today. When criminal justice systems disproportionately impact certain communities. When wealthy defendants get better outcomes than poor ones. When the law is applied selectively based on who you are rather than what you did. These are modern versions of the same problem that plagued the one-time sentence. The one-time sentence also teaches us about the danger of systems that can't be questioned or reformed. When medieval authorities insisted that trial by ordeal was infallible because it revealed God's judgment, they created a system that couldn't adapt or improve. Anytime someone says, "This is how we've always done it," or "This system is beyond criticism," alarm bells should go off. Because that's the same mindset that kept the one-time sentence in place for centuries despite its obvious flaws. Progress in justice requires the humility to admit when we're wrong and the flexibility to change course. Here's something else that's really interesting. The abandonment of the one-time sentence marked a shift from seeing justice as something revealed by divine authority to seeing it as something achieved through human reason and effort. That shift from revelation to reason is foundational to modern legal systems. We don't expect God to intervene in trials. We expect lawyers to present evidence, judges to apply law, and juries to reason their way to verdicts. We've accepted that justice is a human project, flawed and imperfect, requiring constant attention and improvement. The one-time sentence couldn't survive that shift because it was fundamentally based on the opposite premise: that divine intervention made human judgment unnecessary. But maybe the most important legacy of the one-time sentence is this. It's a reminder that things we accept as normal can seem completely insane to future generations. Medieval people genuinely believed trial by ordeal was fair and just. They thought the one-time sentence was reasonable and appropriate. They couldn't see the problems that are obvious to us now. What does that mean for us? What practices do we accept today that future generations will look back on with horror? Mass incarceration? The death penalty? Cash bail systems? Plea bargains that coerce confessions? Civil asset forfeiture? I'm not saying I have the answers, but the one-time sentence reminds us to ask the questions, to examine our systems, to be willing to admit when something isn't working, even if it's been in place for a long time. Because here's the final lesson. The one-time sentence wasn't abandoned because of some grand philosophical breakthrough. It was abandoned because enough people looked at the results, the Gunnolds and Heinrichs and all the other innocent people destroyed by the system, and said, "This isn't working. We need to do better." Real change came from paying attention to real outcomes, from valuing human lives over theoretical systems, from having the courage to admit that something wasn't working and the wisdom to try something new. That's just as relevant now as it was in 1215. So here we are. We've traveled from medieval courtrooms to modern legal theory. We've seen how the one-time sentence worked, why it failed, and what it teaches us. The one-time sentence was a punishment based on finality, on irreversibility, on the idea that divine intervention could bypass the messiness of human judgment. It was abandoned because reality kept intruding, because innocent people kept dying, because the gap between the theory and the practice became too wide to ignore. And that gap, that's where progress happens. That's where change begins. When we notice that our systems aren't delivering justice, that our theories don't match reality, that our methods are hurting people they're supposed to protect. The medieval people who questioned trial by ordeal, who pushed for alternative systems, who eventually convinced the church to withdraw support, they weren't that different from us. They saw injustice, recognized it for what it was, and worked to change it. We can do the same. So here's my challenge to you. What modern practices deserve the same scrutiny we've given the one-time sentence? Where do we see that dangerous combination of finality and fallibility? Where are we prioritizing system over people? Think about it. Talk about it. And hey, leave a comment with your thoughts. I'm genuinely curious what connections you see between medieval justice and modern systems. If you found this deep dive into legal history as fascinating as I did, hit that subscribe button. We're going to keep exploring these dark corners of history, uncovering the strange, brutal, and surprisingly relevant practices of the past. Because here's the thing, we can't understand where we're going unless we understand where we've been. The one-time sentence is gone, but the questions it raised about justice, power, and human fallibility, those are eternal. Thanks for watching. Keep questioning. Keep learning. And remember, today's normal is tomorrow's history. What will future generations say about us?